What if we could operate octopus-like tentacles with our minds instead of being limited by these sledgehammer-like devices at the end of our arms, referring to our hands? I thought, whoever acquires this company, that's going to be the pivotal acquisition in neurotechnology that's going to take this mainstream. I don't think we necessarily need to recognize new rights in that we have a right to privacy, we have a right to freedom of thought, we have a right to self-determination under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What we don't have is a guiding principle to help us understand how those rights should be applied in the digital age. But a much more Orwellian view and future is one in which your very brain activity is being monitored in the workplace. And that's not science fiction, that's already happening. We don't fully understand the technology, how it's emerging, nor do we understand how to put into place the right kind of safeguards that are tech specific. I had the privilege of serving on the expert committee that initially drafted the recommendations as a representative of the United States there. A lot of times with PTSD, one of the hardest things to overcome is the fear you experience of re-experiencing the memory. And so you try to push it away, but when you can actually allow the memory to come and to not be afraid of it, but to simply grieve through it, you can work through it. And for some people, the idea of kind of erasing a memory would be erasing the human experience.
Where do we draw a line, say, between neurotech as medicine and neurotech as commodity or luxury?
I think as long as we're intentional, we still have the capacity collectively to opt out.
Are you optimistic, Professor, that the policy will catch up, or are we already too late? And who are the thinkers, frameworks, or ethical anchors you return to when you're navigating these questions?
Believe that, humans will choose humanity first and will choose a future that ultimately aligns with human flourishing.
The last frontier was never space. It was the mind. And now, for the first time in human history, it is being mapped, mined, and monetized. Brain-computer interfaces, thought surveillance, neural commerce. The question is no longer if our mental lives can be accessed, but who owns the key. Today, on Dark Matter, Bright Minds, we speak with legal philosopher and ethicist Dr. Nita Farahany, whose work on cognitive liberty warns us, once your thoughts become data, they can become evidence, commodities, weapons. So what do we do? When even the silence inside our heads is no longer safe? Stay with us. Welcome, Dr. Nita. How are you? And thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Professor, I want to start with asking you, that brain-computer interfaces are no longer science fiction. They're in schools, offices, courtrooms. But before the policies and protocols, I suppose there was a moment when it all shifted. So when did you first realize that neurotechnology had become urgent and that we need to start regulating it now?
So I've long been following neurotechnology and writing about neurotechnology, but it was hard to see how it would become a mainstream phenomena. That it seemed more likely that it would be for kind of fringe applications and unlikely to be something that everyday consumers or everyday individuals would have both as an opportunity but also as a potential threat to their mental privacy. Then in 2018, I was at a conference, and at that conference there was a person from a startup company who was showcasing a new product that they were developing. And the company's name was Control Labs. And what he was showcasing was neurotechnology in the form of a wristwatch that was picking up peripheral nervous system activity. That is, nervous system activity as it goes from your brain down your arm to your wrist and picks up your intention to move or to swipe or to type. And what he said was, why are we humans such clumsy output devices? We're very good at taking in information, but we're very bad at getting information from our brains out into the rest of the world. And he said, what if we could operate octopus-like tentacles with our minds instead of being limited by these sledgehammer-like devices at the end of our arms, referring to our hands? And what was really remarkable about his presentation that was very eye-opening for me and kind of the turning point in deciding that I really needed to be addressing this was that he was talking about neurotechnology in an entirely different way. Up until then, most consumer neurotechnology was either limited by its form factor, that is, it would be in the form of something worn across the forehead, electrodes that required kind of a hard device on your head, something that really wouldn't be something that we would use every day, other than for kind of limited applications. And the second is neurotechnology up until then had been very limited by what you could do with it. So it was used for meditation, or it was used to, be able to do some gaming devices, like being able to fly a helicopter with your mind, but nothing that you would use in your everyday life. He was addressing both of those things at once. The form factor, that is integrating the neural sensors into an everyday device in the form of something like a watch. And by this point, really smart devices had taken off. And so people were wearing smart watches like Apple Watches. They were wearing, smart rings that could track their activities. And the second thing he was addressing was the application, which is rather than using it for niche products that have niche applications, he was talking about a universal controller, something that could replace your mouse or your keyboard by really just thinking about moving instead. And that was kind of the big aha moment. I thought, whoever acquires this company, that's going to be the pivotal acquisition in neurotechnology that's going to take this mainstream. And I really thought Apple was going to acquire them because they already had the watch, and so it would make sense to integrate it into the watch. I was very surprised when less than a year later, Meta acquired them for somewhere between $500 million to $1 billion. And they've just launched that product in September of 2025, bringing it, even to Best Buy, where you now, in order to navigate with augmented reality glasses, need a neural band in order to do so.
Professor, you've argued that cognitive liberty may be the defining civil liberty of our age. So, what do we really mean when we say liberty of the mind? How do you define cognitive liberty, and what makes it foundational in the neural age?
So first I'd say cognitive liberty really expands well beyond neurotechnology. Cognitive liberty is the right to self-determination over our brain and mental experiences. Sorry, I have a little frog in my throat, so let me clear my throat. So cognitive liberty is really broader than just neurotechnologies. It is the defining issue, I think, for us in the digital age, where self-determination over our brain and mental experiences is no longer a given. And that includes both mental privacy, right, the right to be free from, listening in or interfering with our mental states, to freedom of thought, the capacity to actually have free thoughts of our own that aren't intercepted or manipulated or punished, but also a right to access that information in our brain. These technologies give us unprecedented abilities to peer inward. And that right, the ability to use that for our own good, for our own purposes, to learn more about the human condition, to learn more about our own mental experiences, is a powerful also right to, right? A right to, if somebody is disabled, to be able to interact with the world again, the right to a person who wants to track their sleep or their attention or their focus. And the reason I think it's under threat in an unprecedented way is that digital technologies enable a kind of intervention, a listening, and an interference with our mental states unlike anything we've ever experienced. Right. We've had low levels of this in the past, right? There's advertisement, there's attempts at subliminal, messaging, things like that, but none of them at the scale and precision and capability that's really enabled now by technologies. And neurotechnology helps us see that in a way that no other technology does, because while social media and digital devices really, we all know but don't really realize that they're changing and shaping our minds, to have a device that literally is able to listen to your neural signals and then artificial intelligence that's able to decode it and then potentially even stimulate back, right, particular messages or particular content or particular signals back into the brain that's unprecedented in its ability to really interact with, change, and shape the brain.
Absolutely. Percy, you cite the First Amendment or Article 18 of the UDHR and the Oviedo Convention. So, but can these frameworks truly protect mental privacy in the age of neural data or whatever you described at the moment?
Well, human rights are only as good as the enforcement of them. And so, I think that, are there adequately defined rights in the UNDHR or Oviedo Convention or other places? Yes, we have the rights frameworks in place, but they've never been challenged to be applied in a context like this before. And so while I don't think we necessarily need to recognize new rights in that we have a right to privacy, we have a right to freedom of thought, we have a right to self-determination under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what we don't have is a guiding principle to help us understand how those rights should be applied in the digital age. And that's where a concept like cognitive liberty helps us understand it. It can help us point to those rights and say, look, these rights are on the books, but until we actually enforce them and implement them and pass national legislation consistent with them that actually protects against interference and manipulation of our mental states, they're just rights on paper. They're not rights in reality. And what we need in the modern era is rights in reality.
Then how do different regimes, for example, democratic versus authoritarian, interpret and apply this concept?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, what I would say is that what we see is that different regimes have different commitments to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think while all of the countries who are signatories to the rights say that they respect them, you regularly see interference with them. But you regularly see interference whether it's a democratic regime or whether it's an authoritarian regime. In democratic regimes, you see things like banning of books from, children's schools. You see prohibitions on being able to access medications for, gender-affirming care. You see, people who speak up being deported from countries based on, their protests or their exercise of free speech. In authoritarian countries, you see less of the enforcement of it because what you see is just straight up repression of speech or people who have their speech chilled and who are afraid to be able to speak freely. But even in democratically, elected regimes, you see the use of neurotechnologies and digital technologies in law enforcement, where there are big questions about whether or not that really violates a person's right against self-incrimination to interrogate their mind using advanced technologies. So, I think authoritarian regimes have freer reign to engage in violations of human rights, but it isn't the case that there's a stark contrast between being in an authoritarian regime and a democratic regime for the capacity to, point to violations of human rights.
So could this kind of new technology and this kind of erosion of cognitive liberty, it could create like a new kind of soft totalitarianism where dissent isn't punished, but it just never forms because you have so much control over.
Yeah, I write about this concept in my book, The Battle for Your Brain, where what I talk about is all of the research that shows the chilling effect of putting into place, kind of threats of the use of technology or, the chilling effect of authoritarianism on people's ability to speak up to begin with. So, for example, one of the examples that I detail in the book is how in classrooms in China that the Wall Street Journal reported about, that children as young as 5th grade were required to wear headsets that were monitoring their brain activity for attention or mind wandering. And at that time, it's questionable the extent to which it was even efficacious, like how much signal you could actually get from doing that. So let's assume the technology didn't do anything. Nevertheless, for a child who is being told that their brain activity is being monitored, it has a very powerful chilling effect, right?
Yes.
Their capacity to actually freely think or to be able to experience the kind of mind wandering that leads to self-development and self-understanding is really frustrated by having somebody being told that their brain activity is being monitored by their teachers and by the parents and by the states. And the result is that people don't develop, right? They don't develop their full autonomy. They don't develop the capacity to speak up when they see abuses. They don't fully develop into a human being that is in possession of their own mental states.
Right. Professor, can you just give me like some more examples so that, one could understand, what exactly is being done or planned, with neural data that should most alarm us?
Yeah. So, the book really breaks it down by sector in many ways. And so, one example that we just talked about is in education and its use across education. Workplaces is the second chapter of the book. It really does a deep dive into the ways in which brain activity is being monitored at the workplace. And I think that's an area where everybody can relate to because, increasingly in workplaces worldwide, people are experiencing more and more surveillance, whether that's cameras in the workplace or cameras at home if they're working remotely that are monitoring, how long are they at their computers. But a much more Orwellian view and future is one in which your very brain activity is being monitored in the workplace. And that's not science fiction, that's already happening, where, for more than a decade, some companies have been employing technology like that sold by SmartCap, where they, if their fatigue levels drop below a certain level, alerts are sent to them or to their manager. As part of wellness programs, people voluntarily taking on neural headsets for meditation, but then that data is being repurposed to be able to track their brain activity over time and see if they're suffering from cognitive decline, for example, and, choose who to hire and who to fire, or choose who to promote based on what their brain activity reveals. Thinking about what it means to have a workplace where even your brain activity is monitored means that the very basic capacity for freedom of contract, like enter into a negotiation with your boss about your salary, it's almost impossible to do if your boss has real-time access to what you're thinking. Like they offer you a terrible raise, you're happy to get a raise at all. They're able to see that, you reacted positively, and so the negotiation between you is over before it started. Even basic entertainment, like if you walk up to a perfume counter, there are increasingly more opportunities to put on a neural headset to see how you react to perfume, but then that data is being captured and repurposed and commoditized to be able to fuel an advertisement industry that increasingly tries to shape and change our behaviors and our preferences. Criminal justice departments and police departments are interrogating criminal suspects by looking at recognition memory in their brain, requiring people to wear neural headsets, showing them images of crime scene details that they shouldn't recognize, and then seeing whether their brain registers recognition. There are so many examples that I get into in the book of things that are already happening. And now that the technology has become increasingly more mainstream with launches of products like Meta's neural headband and more products that are hitting the market in 2025 and 2026 and beyond, what you're going to see is an intensification of all of the different kinds of examples that I provide in the book.
Yes, but while we try to regulate all of this, but isn't it something like is trying to regulate something we barely understand? It's like regulation is lagging behind understanding because neuroscience itself is still debating, how to interpret EEG data, BCI signals, attention markers, So if the underlying science is so probabilistic or ambiguous, how can legal systems draw firm conclusions from it?
It's always difficult to try to regulate emerging technologies, and that's true whether it is for a technology that's like neurotechnology that poses novel risks, or technologies like artificial intelligence more generally that we're struggling to regulate. But then increasingly more difficult is the fact that all of these technologies are converging. So if you try to regulate a technology like neurotechnology, which is built into a Fitbit or a watch or a medical device, or it is combined with something like virtual reality, augmented reality, and artificial intelligence, you can easily under-regulate by not understanding it. And so increasingly what people are really looking toward is there a different way to regulate emerging technology based on risk frameworks? So instead of thinking about regulating the technology itself, trying to regulate the applications or the context, right? So imagine if what you're trying to do is provide robust protections in the workplace, you would say, any use of any technology that is used for attention monitoring in the workplace is subject to the following kinds of restrictions. That gives you a kind of future proofing, so that you're really looking at what are the kinds of human activities and human rights that we're trying to protect, and can we be tech neutral in how we address that? Across technologies, data and data commodification is a problem. And so you can look at that and say, it doesn't matter what technology, is used. If the data is used in the following ways or repurposed in the following ways, that's problematic. I think oftentimes it can be really problematic to try to focus on just regulating one single technology for exactly the point that you point to, which is we don't fully understand the technology, how it's emerging, nor do we understand how to put into place the right kind of safeguards that are tech specific.
Who would who has probably more role in kind of setting the standards of this sort of framework or understanding? Is it neuroscientists, ethicists, or technologists?
I think it varies, right? So you need all of those voices at the table. You need, neuroscientists who understand the technology. You need artificial intelligence and computer scientists who understand how AI is being integrated into the technology. You need, ethicists who understand and are able to think about the kind of future casting of the technology. You need legal scholars and lawyers and practitioners. And that's just, thinking about some of the experts you need. You also need community members. You need, people who are impacted by the technology, people who are users of the technology. When you're talking about medical applications of the technology, you need people who are both patients who use the technology, but also family members and caregivers who are impacted by it. Because, if you don't have a full set of voices really at the table from the earliest phases, you miss something. It's not just about consultation, it's about co-design of what regulation and what oversight and what the ethical and broader implications for society are that you need to really understand from the get-go.
Is it really happening, this sort of collaboration amidst these experts from all kinds of areas, and how is it taking shape at the moment, or is it still lacking?
Well, I'd say one thing that's incredibly promising is the UNESCO global standards on the ethics of neurotechnology. This was passed by the member states in November of 2025. And this was through a long consultation process. So I had the privilege of serving on the expert committee that initially drafted the recommendations as a representative of the United States there. But there was first a process where there were experts who were nominated across the 194 member countries to come together. We created an initial draft that then went out for consultation that included, more than 6,000 comments that were gathered and consultations that happened around the world, including consulting with the different kinds of groups that we were just talking about. From that process, then there was a political consultation process where political parties and political representatives from the different member countries came together and really debated line by line the recommendations that ultimately led to the ratification and adoption of it. And that provides, in many ways, a blueprint for countries to think about what the broader ethical implications are and how to put into place the set of kind of laws and regulations and incentives and funding opportunities to try to ethically align the technology with human flourishing. And it's really built on a human rights framework around these concepts of mental privacy and self-determination and freedom of thought as a way to kind of inform the process. From there, ideally, what happens is member countries continue that consultation process, right? So as they turn those recommendations that are a standard into laws and regulations and incentives and funding opportunities within their own countries, those kinds of consultations should continue so that the broadest set of individuals are really engaged throughout the process, and that the technology is developed in a way that really is designed to benefit the most number of people and to minimize the downside risks of it.
Right. But if I can just take this into a more personal direction, and amidst all of this policy debates is a quieter, more intimate story. You've written and spoken about the devastating loss of your daughter and how you turned to neurotechnology not as a theorist or ethicist, but as a grieving mother, seeking a way through. So could you walk us through what led you to use neural stimulation in that moment and how it kind of reshaped your grief?
Yeah. So I would say, first, even before then, I have been somebody who has used neurotechnology. And so, I am somebody who has suffered from migraines for most of my life. And so I have experimented with, every drug, every device that possibly could be used to treat migraines. And that includes, even things like helmets that provide, magnetic ultrasound stimulation, and using TENS devices that are on the forehead and that provide neural stimulation. So I was somebody familiar with and who had long used neurotechnology and experimented with neurotechnology to try to address one of the debilitating things that I really grapple with, which is chronic migraines. I had found long ago that using neurotechnology for neurofeedback to be able to see my mental states with respect to meditation and being able to modulate it for meditation also helped as a preventive for migraine. So that's context that probably matters, because I might not have been willing to embrace neurotechnology when we faced the loss of our child. But after we lost our second daughter, Callista, she fell ill from RSV and unfortunately didn't recover and had a prolonged hospitalization before she passed away. It was, I found that there was the loss, which was overwhelming, but then in the years that continued, it didn't really get better. I couldn't sleep at night. I over time realized that I had developed PTSD, and so every time I would really close my eyes, I would see these vivid scenes from, first taking her into the hospital and kind of everything that ensued while she was in the hospital and that followed. And that became really debilitating for me over time, and it became particularly pronounced when we had our third child, Electra, because, I wouldn't react to her sniffles or sneezes or cries in an ordinary way, but in a more extraordinary way. I think I called 911 on more than several occasions for when, I would worry about something that had happened to her, even though it was a normal kind of baby thing. And I had tried traditional therapy. I had tried talk therapy. I had tried exposure therapy to overcome the PTSD, and really nothing had worked. And so then in working with my therapist at that point, they suggested maybe we could try with neurofeedback, because really what's happening is that every time you are, trying to remember, you're seizing up and you're unable to kind of allow the memories to come. And so maybe if you can see that and then you can work your way through it, then maybe you'll be able to actually work through this. And so, at that point I was like, well, anything is worth trying, right? And it really only took a few sessions of being able to, essentially see my mental states, visualize them, and then be able to modulate them as I had learned to do with meditation and with other kinds of neurofeedback, to be able to allow the memories to come. A lot of times with PTSD, one of the hardest things to overcome is is the fear you experience of re-experiencing the memory. And so you try to push it away. But when you can actually allow the memory to come and to not be afraid of it, but to simply grieve through it, you can work through it. And so we did that for a number of sessions. And now I'd say I have worked through the PTSD. You can never let go of grief. You will always grieve the loss of a child. But it's become something that doesn't control me anymore. I can sleep. I can close my eyes. It's not that the memories come and overtake me and seize me. When a memory comes, I experience it, and it passes through like any other memory does. And in my talks, I talk about how there are other forms of this, even more innovative forms, like ways that you can do decoded neurofeedback. And so rather than having to experience the memories that I did, you can essentially rewrite memories by tracking what those neural signatures of the traumatic memories are, and then retrain those neural signatures on things like playing a game or other kinds of activities. And so there are a lot of ways in which PTSD therapy has been really revolutionized by the ability to be able to use technology to change it. And, in my case, the memories aren't gone, the grief isn't gone, but the trauma, like the PTSD, is gone. And so it becomes like an ordinary form of grief rather than an extraordinary and debilitating form of grief.
So are there ethical issues that surround the idea of, say, altering the emotional charge of memory?
I mean, for sure, right? Like there was a book, not a book, maybe it was a book too, but there was a movie, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, that really right gets into this, which is, in many ways, grief and memories and trauma and working through those things, those are part of the human experience, is part of what allows us to prevail. It's part of where art and music and poetry come from. And for some people, the idea of kind of erasing a memory would be erasing the human experience, would be, we learn from trauma. We learn, imagine somebody who is a combatant in the field. The trauma that they experience in many ways is part of the inhibition that leads to us not, killing a civilian in the field. Like it's part of what leads to kind of morals and development. I'd say, like, there are very few people who I think would advocate for simply erasing memories as a way to overcome life. That, if you have a bad breakup, rather than just erasing the person, that we learn and grow from that. That's part of how we develop. I think there's something different about learning to modulate and using it for treatment and therapy the way I did, versus imagining a world where you're just selectively erasing trauma from the human experience. That being said, would I, stand in opposition if somebody decided that a memory was too traumatic for them, or too painful for them, or simply that they wanted to forget and they chose to erase it? I wouldn't. I think that's part of self-determination, is giving people a right to make those choices for themselves. But, if somebody asked me, is this how I should live my life? Is this what leads to a good life? I'd probably say, no, that's not, the best way to be fully human and to embrace being fully human. But I think we have to each individually make that choice for ourselves, recognizing what we might be giving up by losing our memories that really shape and help us. For me, having lost a child and survived it, emotionally, physically, mentally, and still thriving with my family, that has taught me that I can survive anything. And when I lost my mother recently, which was devastating, there was a knowledge that I would survive, that I would be able to work through it. And that is something that is a gift in many ways, right? Which is to know, like, that even in the face of trauma, you can survive, you can thrive. And so I was able to face that grief with a resilience that I might not have been able to face it with had I not gone through all of the work that I did after losing my daughter.
Right. But how it just raises another sort of a scenario, because I remember the Black Mirror's latest season where there was an episode called Common People, where a company called Rivermind, it offers a subscription service to keep consciousness alive after trauma. But it has tiers, the more you pay, the more pleasure, peace, or clarity you can experience, And if you can't afford the premium tier, the company begins to advertise through your mind. It's fiction, but barely. So how far are we really from a world where access to emotional recovery is stratified by wealth?
Yeah, I mean, there's a real possibility with all of these technologies, right? Which is access to technologies is stratified by wealth right now, and the more powerful these technologies become, the more that gap will be pronounced unless we choose to do something differently about it, right? And whether that's access to technology that modifies your memory or enhances your abilities, or therapeutic benefits that a lot of these technologies provide for people. For somebody who loses the capacity to speak and uses neurotechnology as the way that they can recommunicate with the world, it's really hard to think that only somebody who's wealthy could afford that, and somebody who isn't would be denied that same capacity to be able to re-engage with the world. And so I think we have to think a lot about what our payment structures and reimbursement structures, investments and incentives will look like in society to ensure that there is not that kind of stratification by wealth, that the people who need the technology have ways to be able to access it, that the people who develop the technology have the support to be able to make it as widely available to as many people as possible, if that's what people want and desire, and it's something that they seek out. And that also involves thinking about what rules and regulations are, because if one way to think about it is, if you create a technology where it is that the structure of pleasure is that you have to pay more in order to access pleasure, maybe that's not how we should allow pricing to occur for different products, especially for kind of essential products to the human condition. So I think, all of those are part of the conversations that we ought to be having in society as we think about what do we want to invest in, what do we want to support, what do we want to regulate and prohibit with respect to stratification of technology.
Right. I was where do we draw a line, between neurotech as medicine and neurotech as commodity or luxury?
That is, I'd say, a line that is almost impossible to draw, right? Which is the difference between therapeutic and enhancement is an issue that we have not been able to address in any area, and neurotechnology will not be an exception in that.
Right. Because as we move towards the end, I just want to, to speak of liberty, healing, and surveillance in one breath is to live in a paradox, but perhaps paradox is where the future lives. So what forms of public resistance or refusal do you see emerging? And is there any space even left where we can opt out, actually?
I think it's very difficult to see what a future of opting out looks like, but it's not impossible. If you look, for example, at what's just happened in Australia, where they've put into place limitations on children engaging with social media before the age of 16. What they're trying to do is create a protected space for childhood, to create a space where children are able to grow up without their brains being, kind of fundamentally rewired by the ways that social media are designed and implemented. And, it's an experiment, I think, of trying to say, is there a way to opt people out of a future where self-determination is limited and controlled and changed by tech companies who are making choices about how to do that? And we can create those spaces. We can decide, for example, in schools or for children, that we're not going to use particular forms of technology, that, AI won't teach our children, humans will teach our children. And I think as long as we're intentional, we still have the capacity collectively to opt out. But it requires collective action. It's harder for individual parents or individual people to make those choices. If an employee goes into the workplace and says, no, I don't want neural monitoring in the workplace, but they're the only ones who say it, they simply lose their job. They don't actually create a resistance to a kind of neural surveillance. But if employees collectively say together, we would like access to the technology to be able to monitor our attention and productivity personally and individually, but we refuse to allow the data to flow to our employer or to a third-party company. We want the power to keep that data on our own devices and the insights to be something that we use to empower us rather than is used to oppress us. Collectively, they have a voice. Collectively, they have power. Individually, it's very difficult for any one person to stand up alone. And so I think there is space, but that space requires that people work together and to have the kinds of conversations we're having to say, what's the future we want? What's the kind of reality that we want to live in?
Are you optimistic, Professor, that the policy will catch up, or are we already too late? And who are the thinkers, frameworks, or ethical anchors you return to when you're navigating these questions?
Yeah, so I am inherently optimistic, and so I believe that, humans will choose humanity first and will choose a future that ultimately aligns with human flourishing. So when I feel less hopeful, I turn to modern philosophers and historians like Timothy Snyder, or to philosophers like Harry Frankfurt, who inspire a lot of my work about how to think about the concepts of freedom in a more constrained world, or places like John Stuart Mill, who wrote so eloquently about the importance of freedom of thought and how we recognize and preserve and protect it for society. And those kinds of concepts inspire me to continue writing, to continue thinking, to continue speaking, to continue trying to inform a future that is aligned with human well-being.
Right. But in the end, there is going to be this consciousness paradox, right? So we are decoding fatigue, intention, even mood, all from neural signatures, but we still don't know what consciousness is. So what exactly are we regulating? Is it brain data or something more sacred, the very experience of being?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'd say it's more, I don't even think about it as what we're regulating than what's at stake. And, what's at stake is what it means to be human. And I think that's what we are increasingly having to grapple with in the modern era is, what is the experience of being human? Is it unique? Is it something that we can protect? Is it something, while there are aspects of our minds that may be decoded, is there something more fundamental that's at stake, which is, not just even consciousness, but something about self-determination itself, something about the kind of core of our human experiences. And that's, I think, what I worry about most with cognitive liberty is protecting that core, protecting that concept of, defining and protecting that core human nature, human experience from being manipulated, from being reshaped in ways that are beyond our perception and control.
Absolutely. Well, that was my last question, Professor. But yeah, I suppose in the end, cognitive liberty may not be a luxury. It may be the last human right we have left to name. And thank you so much for joining us for the interview.
Well, thank you for having me.